Prayer for the Big Morning. People my heart with the living, their cries like fists, their sight healing my eyes for closing night. Would be that one and populous heart of man, O cries like fist, O sights set free. This week I've been steeping myself in the wisdom, poetry, and liturgy of VanDerburgh, the Jesuit priest who, alongside his brother Philip and others, spearheaded the plowshares movement in the mid-century. Perhaps spearheaded is a bad verb. As many of you likely witnessed and maybe took part in, that movement produced a series of actions against institutional militarism in the US, set into particular urgency during the ongoing failed war in Vietnam. Their pious actions sought to permanently stop empire and war as an answer to the prophet Isaiah's call. They shall beat their sword into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore. Dan was also a poet, one that played within the genre conventions of liturgy. In his 1968 Suburban Prayer, Berrigan writes, "This Lent, celebrate in the haunted house, the world." Like a good Jesuit priest, Dan's poems draw on the Psalms even when no psalmist language is used. In his devotion to the words that Jesus sung, and likely had sung to him as a child, the emotional textures of that millennia-old hymnal pour out of Berrigan's poems, poems which never treat joy as an escape from the pain of this world, but instead seek to have joy and suffering side by side as the promise of this life until we meet the everlasting. This is what the Psalms do so well, stacking up emotions without resolving them. And so I see them in so much of his work. And I see that in his work because I'm in my own imperfect new relationship with the Psalms, which is basically my suggestion for you after today's service, through and until we hit the end of Lent in triumph together. Get to know the Psalms like you would a cousin, an old family member you've lost track of that has shown up in your Zoom call. Try and enter these words with generous witness, without rushing, without a reason beyond relationship, maybe with a sense of humor. Once you do, you'll hear its gathering song across lots of other music and language and media. It's one tool we can use to connect ourselves to grandparents, neighbors. It places our feelings in the concert of all the feelings within the human. And at its most bare and vivid level, it was the founding blocks of Jesus' own devotional life. Good enough for God among us, perfect enough for us all, each of us with God's image in our own faces. We're starting our walk toward Easter, and as such, one of the first pieces of the story of Jesus' adult life as we know it, at least in the Gospel of Luke, is in his trials in the wilderness. Here he is tempted by Satan and his triumphs against him, against temptations that would make his life much easier at the cost of abandoning his Creator, let alone all of us. After he survives the trials, Jesus heads back again into his middle-of-nowhere hometown to gather his followers in preparation for his short but world-shifting ministry, an affair that took place in a tense territory occupied by a foreign army, which is to say, in history. And shortly after the human life of Jesus closed, the center of his religious life, the Temple of Jerusalem, was laid to waste by Rome, scattering and shifting his Judaism. And at that same time, the strange Jesus movement was growing and would become the face of Western empire and piety and complication for hundreds of years. In Luke 4, Jesus went for 40 days without food and dealt with his demons, or the true demon, depending on how you choose to interpret this passage. Though we gather in belief of his status as merged as God, with the Father and the Holy Spirit, uncreated, he was raised a Jew with Jewish texts and an understanding of creation. So the Psalms are precious for us to hold and read and sing with him, and with our siblings across the world and across time. Number 91 is this first week of Lent's psalm this year. Instead of Jesus reciting it to his followers, which he does throughout the Gospels, we see it cited in this chapter of Luke by Satan, not by Christ, when Satan says, "For it is written, he will command his angels concerning you, and they will lift you up in their hands so that you will not strike your foot against a stone." Satan quoting the Psalms to a starving Jesus, alone in the desert. Words set to a song that Jesus knows, as we know our own lover's voice. Language that Jesus knew in many languages. This mysterious tale. And as we heard, Jesus replies, "It is also written, do not put the Lord your God to the test." It's his protective move. This fabulous bit of story can't be plumbed to a pithy conclusion, I hope. But this week, one fragment of message that I carry is that when I hold God in my daily steps, I know with depth and clarity how to responsibly identify and resist cruelty toward creation. Even when my own favorite words or favorite figures are offered to me as trustworthy, it's up to me to keep alive my relationship with goodness itself, so that I cannot be swept into a bad deal with all the forms of selfishness that destroy creation and wound God. It's also a tiny story about interpretation itself, our best muscle to nurture in this life, one of the best gifts from God herself that come into the human. Folks outside of this community may flatten that into the idea of critical thought, but we may think of this interpretation as far more elemental or maternal. We know in our deepest place what is best for our beloved, and we are required as Christians and as lovers to interpret all things toward that attempt to be the most loving and that fact of knowing love. We approach everything then with curiosity, wisdom, and depth of thinking, so that when our favorite heroes touch our deep nostalgia, maybe sublimated so we're not even aware of it, using our favorite poetry or music or phrase or outfit, we still have some will in us left to ask, is something cruel testing me right now? Am I really loyal to this? This is my Lenten meditation. It's about how we live life in history, celebrating the haunted house, this world, by studying it as a family member, studying our own place, studying our relationship with God and the Christ who modeled it before us. That voices like Berrigan's crash over us today as brave witness to the hypocrisy of much of Christian history, the history of empire and war, speaks to the calamity state of this world. In Lent, we follow Jesus along his short ministry as a full man who experienced backaches, food poisoning, heartaches, frustration in those human years that made up his life before defeating death at Easter. We sit with him in the wilderness, slowing our process to take in the hauntedness of this world and its temptations toward cruelty. We meditate during this Lent. And during this week, we meditate on the intense sacrifices Jesus made before being tortured on the cross to disseminate his message of radical love to a hurting world. I don't think this is a time all about waiting, then. It's too loving. It's more like pregnancy, which requires so much from the body and the spirit and the community, from caretakers, from luck, from trying. It's a kind of moment of inverse gestation from what we experience in Advent. We're gestating in the goop of our own sinfulness, freed in so many ways, but not quite yet. This Lent, celebrate in the haunted house, this world. This world as a haunted house reminds us of all the ancestors before us, spirits giving our own feelings shape and depth and language. Our world is peopled with gestures and fingerprints of beings long gone, like Dan, who passed away in 2016, like the witnesses of the living Christ at the first Easter and the first Lent, in the first revolts of enslaved peoples against their masters in the Americas, in the first draft cards burned in witness to the massacres unfolding against the then Third World by the unprotected young and hurting children of this country, children forced into cruel journeying so that political ideals, fictions, ideas you can't carry in your hand, could snatch bread and multiply complex sins far from the halls of power that always make the choice for war. Hells on earth unleashed by a country claiming special intimacy with Christ, the Prince of Peace. This world is haunted. The world is a single house of spirits or spirit or spirited movement. Jesus carried that tortured knowing far beyond our abilities and still resisted the temptation to bargain away the fact of goodness in order to reduce his own suffering as he starved. We are saved from such tasks. But in this wilderness of Lent, we can at least tell the truth to ourselves about what it means to prepare for the triumph against that which runs away from God. Easier said than done, which is why I suggest some psalmic recitation into your daily fold if you have it in you. With each reread, you'll find yourself more intimate with the language of Christ's understanding of time and the global church. And you belong here, regardless of how worthy you feel. Maybe that recitation will lead you into writing your own words to honor the haunted glory within all of us, which is how I got to Berrigan in the first place, and also was the most precious part about working with my partner Isabel to do those poetry teaching workshops over the past few weeks. We have what it is in us to write prayers in the poetic mode, taking what is within us and placing it in the ear of our Creator. People my heart with the living, their cries like fists, their sights healing. Our sights healing when we open ourselves to God's presence in the lives of the people we share space with on this earth. When we direct ourselves in love to the woundedness, there is freedom of a sort. When we hold on to the rock of our salvation through that loving, there is peace of a sort. So my 3 ideas for you to consider this week: Psalms to recite, scriptures to study, and this week it's Jesus refusing to cheat his way into power, alchemizing his own power towards spreading the good news to all people. And the 3rd suggestion is that you find some of your own words to lift up, tinker with, and offer to our shared Creator as poetry and prayer. O sights set free. We owe it to ourselves to pay attention to the language that has held us and that holds us still into the miracle of each new day. In our inescapable belovedness, we're free to free others with forgiving love and clarity and creativity. Let us close then in a prayer poem based on Psalm 100, written by congregant Hazel Vespa during one of our poetry writing workshops a few weeks ago. My prayer of thanksgiving. Know that God is ever present. His steadfast love endures across all generations. Therefore, come into his presence, giving thanks. Amen.